Study 149. Khamis and Khamis Studio, The Body as Blueprint, from the Objects of Affection collection. The mold problem, why the industrial shoe is structurally hostile to the body. Every conventional shoe begins with a lie. It begins with a standardized proprietary foot-shaped form owned by the brand, licensed to the factory, and never shown to the customer, and with the mold, the steel cavity that enforces that last's geometry across thousands of identical units. The mold is not merely a manufacturing instrument, it is an ideological apparatus, a material declaration that the human body must conform to the industrial object, not the industrial object to the human body. The mold is the physical crystallization of what the OAC has called the hollowed object logic at the level of production, a system in which the specificity of individual human anatomy is systematically extracted and replaced with a statistical average, generating an artifact that serves no one's foot precisely and every investor's spreadsheet generously. The financial architecture of this system is its cruelest structural feature. A brand seeking to bring a single shoe to market must commission separate molds for the left and right sides across every half size in a full run, a capital commitment that runs into the hundreds of thousands of dollars before a single unit reaches a customer. Minimum order quantities follow from mold economics. You cannot amortize a mold across 50 units. You must produce thousands. The mold thus enforces overproduction at the structural level, generating surplus that must be liquidated, discounted, or destroyed. The warranty of obsolescence is not a design choice. It is the mathematical consequence of mold economics. The system must produce more than it can sell, and must replace what it has sold with new iterations to justify the next mold investment. The cycle feeds itself. This barrier to entry is not accidental. It is the speculative velocity of the industrial shoe economy made physical. A moat that ensures only corporations with access to deep financialization of luxury infrastructure can compete, that independent designers remain dependent on these corporations as employees or licensees, and that the object remains the property of the system rather than the instrument of the maker. Khamis identified this structural condition with precision in his primary interview with OAC. It's almost impossible unless you have a ton of investors, or you are just rich, to get into producing footwear. There is just so much upfront cost with molds and sourcing materials. That was my first way to actually produce shoes. I can make one, and I can make a profit. Khamis is not describing a market inefficiency. He is diagnosing the structural condition that makes genuine functional obligation, the commitment of the object to the specific body that uses it, impossible within the mold system. The mold cannot be individuated. It is, by its material nature, a tool of standardization. Every object it produces inherits the mold's indifference to the body in question. This is what the OAC, building on the analysis in From Function to Fisher, identifies as the design system's foundational betrayal. Not that it produces bad shoes, but that it produces objects constitutively incapable of serving their stated function, the support of the specific human foot, because the system that makes them requires their indifference to that foot as a precondition for its economics. The mold is not a manufacturing tool. It is an ideological imposition, the industrial shoe economy's structural declaration that the body must conform to the system, not the system to the body. Every object born from a mold inherits this indifference as a design feature. The question Khamis Studio answers is not how do we make the mold cheaper. It is, what happens to every downstream consequence when you remove the mold entirely. Without a mold, there is no minimum order quantity. Without a minimum, there is no structural imperative for overproduction. Without overproduction, there is no surplus requiring liquidation. Without liquidation pressure, there is no disposable culture necessity built into the economics. And most critically, without the mold standardization, the object becomes free to be specific to a material logic, specific to a design intention, and through the technology Khamis deploys, specific to a body. The VR studio as sovereign space. When the designer's body enters the Khamis designs shoes in virtual reality. This is reported in Design and Technology Media as a workflow innovation, a headline about the future arriving in the Midwest. Read through the PLCFA framework. It is something structurally more significant, the abolition of the two-dimensional mediation between the designer's spatial intention and the three-dimensional object. It is the algorithm of the hand, the unbroken chain of intentional gesture from body to form, preserved intact across the full arc from ideation to production output. The conventional footwear design pipeline is a translation machine. The designer's spatial intuition is first collapsed into a two-dimensional sketch. That sketch is handed to a developer, who reinterprets it into a three-dimensional technical pack using CAD tools that impose their own formal logic on the intent. That technical pack goes to a factory, where pattern makers interpret it again. A third layer of institutional mediation before a physical sample exists. By the time that the sample arrives, often 6 to 9 months after the original sketch, it has passed through 3 distinct translation events, each a potential site of loss, compromise, and institutional noise. The result is, at best, a competent approximation of the designer's original intent. At worst, it is a committee product wearing a designer's name. Khamis rejected this pipeline not ideologically but practically, because it was failing him as a creative instrument. He described the specific failure and its resolution in his OAC interview. "I always struggled to communicate my ideas from 2D when it's a 3D product. I could sketch, I was good at it, but I needed a 3D model, and none of the 3D modeling software was working for me. The VR technology met me at that same time, this really intuitive way of creating and sculpting things. I'm working on the shoe 3-dimensionally in front of me. I'm seeing the final product 3-dimensionally before you would even hand off a blueprint." What Khamis describes is the collapse of the translation chain. The designer and the design exist in the same spatial register simultaneously. The intentional gesture, the hand moving through virtual space, adjusting a curve, thickening a zone, placing a texture drawn from natural precedent, produces geometry directly, without the mediation of a 2-dimensional representation that requires reinterpretation. The OAC study on the algorithm of the hand establishes this unbroken chain of intention as the foundational condition for genuine material singularity. Not merely that an object is unique, but that its uniqueness is traceable to a continuous line of intent from the maker's body to the object's form, uncorrupted by institutional translation. The gravity sketch documentation of the Khamis Studio Instinct shoe, the first sneaker designed end-to-end on that platform, provides a rare, detailed record of what this translation collapse looks like in practice. Khamis brought his inspiration research, dart frog feet, dehydrated cactus surface geometry, into a shared virtual studio, and constructed 4 fully realized concept designs in 3-dimensional space directly. A volume of creative output that Gravity Sketch noted would require 2 to 3 times the time in a conventional process. Once the design direction was approved, Khamis continued refining the design in VR, exchanging 3D files with a factory partner in Portugal. The factory received Rhino and Gravity Sketch files and returned revision proposals at the millimeter level, a precision that 2-dimensional blueprints cannot structurally achieve. The first physical sample accurately reflected the design intent, requiring only minor adjustments, compressing what would normally be 2 to 3 full sampling rounds into one. Gravity Sketch documented the workflow, saving 3 months of development time and eliminating the environmental cost of additional sample production rounds. This is not a workflow optimization in the conventional sense. It is a structural transformation in who controls the object's form across its entire production arc. The designer's intentionality does not dissipate across translation events. It accumulates from the first VR session through the factory handoff to the finished print. The legibility of labor, the traceability of the maker's intention in the finished form, is preserved end-to-end. The designer is present in the object not as a signature on a technical pack that passed through 3 other hands, but as the continuous organizing intelligence of the object's geometry from first gesture to final print. In the PLCFA register, this is a claim to sovereignty over the design process itself. In Khamis' studio, the designer's intention does not pass through translation. The designer's body and the design exist in the same spatial register, simultaneously. This is not a workflow innovation. It is the reclamation of authorial sovereignty over the object's form, the algorithm of the hand, fully preserved. Khamis arrived at this methodology through the practical failure of alternatives, not through theoretical positioning. He could not communicate his 3-dimensional intentions through 2-dimensional means without unacceptable loss. He found a tool that eliminated that loss. The theoretical significance of the choice was not the reason for making it, which is precisely the signature of authentic contemporary practice in the PLCFA mode. Structural conclusions that precede and exceed the theoretical vocabulary that eventually names them. Khamis did not set out to embody a framework. He set out to make a better shoe. The framework recognized him. One material, one form, the single print object as post-luxury proposition. The objects Khamis Studio produces through the Zellerfeld platform share a structural characteristic easy to overlook in coverage focused on their visual novelty. They are made from a single material. The Hezi slide, the Aero, the Instinct Mule, each is a continuously printed single material form built from Zellerfeld's proprietary Zeller foam, a thermoplastic polyurethane (TPU) lattice structure fused at the point of printing rather than assembled from discrete components. No stitching, no adhesive, no lasting tape, no separate outsole bonded to an upper, no liner inserted after the fact. The object is, structurally and materially, one thing. From a PLCFA perspective, this single material monism inverts the traditional luxury value proposition at the level of production logic. The conventional luxury shoe accumulates what the PLCFA framework calls semantic burden through the multiplication of materials, processes, and specialist hands. Calfskin from one tannery, sole unit from another, lining from a third, welt stitching by a fourth. Each layer is a signal of complexity, of difficulty, of accumulated cost. The Goodyear welt exists as much to be seen as to perform. The calfskin upper exists as much to communicate sign value as to protect the foot. The traditional luxury shoe is a semiotic delivery system that happens to enclose a body part, but this accumulation of components is also a structural liability. Each junction between materials is a site of future failure. The adhesive bond between upper and outsole degrades under flexion and heat. The stitching at the welt eventually loosens. The counter-stiffener loses its rigidity, the insole compresses unevenly. The luxury shoe, beneath its surface narrative, is an assembly of incompatibilities held together by adhesives and the consumer's willingness to cycle through new pairs. Planned obsolescence is not ideological in this system. It is material, engineered into the junction between components. Khamis's single material object eliminates these junctions entirely. There are, in Zellerfeld's own product language, no stitching, glue, or weak points. The object cannot delaminate because it has no layers to separate. The outsole cannot detach because it is not a separate entity. The material that cushions the foot is the same material that protects it from the ground, the same material that structures the silhouette, the same material that will, at the end of life, be returned to the Zellerfeld system and processed into a future print. This is functional obligation at the level of material architecture. The object's commitment to the body that uses it is not structurally undermined by manufacturing compromises buried within its construction. The form serves the function completely because the form is the material and the material is the function. Khamis articulated the creative consequence of this constraint in his OAC interview. You already have the 3D last. You have guidelines you have to fall into. It's all one material. So you're just sculpting this thing, you're not putting all these different components together. Now I can just focus on that. Full creativity within these guidelines with one material. For the most part, all the functionality and wearability of this footwear will fall in line. I can just now design within these frameworks. This is precisely the condition the OAC framework identifies as tactical friction, the productive constraint that disciplines rather than suppresses creative intention. The single material mandate does not limit Khamis's design. It forces the design to achieve its effects through form alone, without the option of delegating aesthetic complexity to material multiplicity. Every surface decision, the lattice density that determines flex, the wall thickness that determines support, the geometry derived from the dart frog's foot, and the dehydrated cactus's surface, must do its work through form rather than through material substitution. The Khamis Studio object is, in this respect, more structurally similar to sculpture than to conventional footwear. A single material interrogated to its full potential. The OAC study on Herms and mycelium biotech identified a distinction between sustainability as a brand narrative and sustainability as a structural commitment. The Khamis Studio single material protocol is an instance of the latter. The object's recyclability, its capacity to re-enter the material stream at the end of life, is not a supply chain add-on or a marketing claim. It is an inherent property of the single material construction. A multi-component shoe cannot be truly recycled because its incompatible materials resist separation. A single material print has no such problem. The circular economy argument is encoded in the object's form, not appended to it. The foot scanner's custodian's contract, the biometric binding of object to body after purchasing a Khamis Studio shoe through the Zellerfeld platform, the buyer receives a link to a foot scanning protocol. A standard sheet of paper is placed on the floor as a size reference. A phone held at prescribed angles above each foot. 2 images per foot, processed by the Zellerfeld algorithm against a standard size calibration. The resulting data adjusts the printed form's dimensions to account for the specific length, width, and individual asymmetry between the buyer's left and right feet. Every human body's feet are measurably asymmetrical. Industrial sizing ignores this because the mold system cannot accommodate it. The Zellerfeld protocol accounts for it because the print system can. Khamis walked through this protocol in his OAC interview. It's not exactly an exact custom fit, but you can adjust things. I have basically attached an algorithm to a standard size, and it can adjust to individual feet. Not only their personal size, but also their individual feet, because some people's feet are not exactly the same length. Maybe not noticeable, but a few millimeters can make a difference with fit. The foot scan is not a customer service feature. It is a structural declaration. Every object that emerges from this protocol is, by biometric definition, specific to one body. No two buyers with similar standard sizes will receive identical objects. No other body has the same scan signature. The object's form has been organized around data that only one person's body could have provided. This is the material enactment of what the OAC framework designates as the custodian's contract at its most literal level. The object was made for this body, which means this body has an obligation to the object that no other body can discharge. The fit belongs to one person, biometrically. The object is, in the most precise structural sense, of that person. The OAC study on the cost of stewardship establishes the custodian's contract as the formal instrument through which the relationship between an object and its steward is structured as an ongoing obligation, a framework of care and accountability that persists across the object's life, rather than as a transaction that ends at the point of purchase. The Zellerfeld foot scan enacts this principle at the level of material production. Before the object exists, the steward's body has already shaped it. The obligation runs in both directions before the object is printed. The body is inside the object. The object is structured around the body. This is the precise inversion of the industrial mold logic. Khamis was candid about the current limits of the scanning system in his OAC interview. It captures length and width in the weight-bearing position, the shape of the foot as it actually contacts the ground under load, but has not yet extended to arch shape, pronation pattern, or the three-dimensional topography of the sole. Zellerfeld's documentation notes that a foot scan taken with the foot elevated produces different measurements than one taken weight-bearing, and that the weight-bearing shape is the correct basis for a fit that functions during actual walking. The direction of development is clear. As the biometric resolution of the scan increases, the object's specificity to its steward deepens proportionally, moving structurally toward the effective object, an artifact so precisely calibrated to its steward that its value is constitutively non-transferable, because no other body could engage it as its original owner can. The foot scan is not a sizing tool. It is a biometric custodian's contract, the moment at which the industrial object, constitutively indifferent to the body, becomes a sovereign object, specific to one life, shaped by one body's particular geometry before it is even printed. There is also a structural consequence for the resale market that deserves explicit attention. Because every Khamis Studio shoe is custom printed from a specific foot scan, no pair fits anyone else as well as it fits its original owner. This is not a preference claim. It is a biometric fact. The shoe cannot be resold at a value premium because its primary functional attribute, the precise fit, cannot be transferred to a secondary buyer. The conventional sneaker resale market is predicated on the transferability of speculative value. The Khamis Studio object structurally resists this transferability in its physical geometry. The anti-speculative autonomy of the object is encoded not in legal restriction, but in the printed form itself. The full study is available at objectsofaffectioncollection.com.